So, Julia, thank you so much for joining us on this us. I'm not a royal we. Thank you so much for joining me on this conversation today to explore your journey into becoming a coaching supervisor. And I wonder if you could start by just sharing a bit of your background about who you are as a human being, but also as a coach.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm delighted to be here, Nick. Thank you so much for asking me. So in terms of my background, if we go back into the swirls of time, when I was at university, I did a master's in psychoanalysis and just the literature around it, not the practice of it, because I was early 20s, and I'd always decided that I'd wanted to be an analyst. And I was very sensibly told by some tutors at the time that 22 was far too young to consider being an analyst. Looking back on that now, they had a point. They really had a point. So I went out into the world, and one of my tutors said to me, actually, what you want to do is you want to mark time, which was incredibly good advice. So I went into the world of mental health services, which I loved. And then I had my children, and I found that that wasn't a job that I could do with it just wasn't compatible for me, at any rate, with small children. So I took a career break to look after them. And then my husband very wisely pointed out to me, when you need to go back to work because you're not a lady who stays, at home. And kudos to them. The women who run the PTA, they do a far better job than I could do. So, but that's not you. Um, so I went to coach. I did some voluntary coaching for the long-term unemployed at a local charity. Absolutely loved it, and kind of fate brought me to coaching that way.
And I know from our previous conversations, you're very dynamic, psychodynamically influenced. What was that? I mean, obviously, you did psychoanalysis as a master's, but you've obviously now practicalized it within your coaching. How did that take place from coaching in that first instance to deepening your practice in that way?
That is such a great question. I Because I'd also, as well, like literally just before I got pregnant, I started to train as a therapist, and for a variety of reasons, it just wasn't for me at that time. And then I got pregnant, and I was like, you know what, let's focus on being a mum. So it was always something that was there. And then when I became a coach, I was like, I just think we're missing a trick. And throughout my coach training, it was never mentioned. Psychodynamics was never mentioned. And I thought, yeah, I still think we're missing something. And I was always thinking, how can I bring it in? And it's actually when I did the coaching and supervision diploma, and there was a section on psychodynamics, I was like, oh, come on. And I did some more research, and it's just not. It. I think coaching is starting to look at it, but that's actually part of my big mission now, is to try and marry the worlds, because I think coaches work with the unconscious, they work with dynamics in the room, and if you want to do the best for your clients, then surely that's an area that we should look at.
So for you, that sounds like it was something you figured out for yourself. You didn't go to a specific course and train in that. You just kind of married the two in your own mind and somehow put it to practice.
Yeah, yeah, it was. I think because I'd always had it there, it was always part of who I was. It was always kind of like bubbling away at the background, and I was always thinking, but why don't we talk about this? And I think some of it is because, and I remember when I did my assignment for the coaching supervision diploma, I wrote about this, and I said, Friday's not very trendy at the moment, and I think that's unfair. He is difficult to read, and a lot of that is translated very badly. So there are some new translations out. So for anybody watching, you want to read a bit of Freud, grab a new translation. I'd read a case study, because they are, they're fascinating, just as a historical document. And so for me, it was there, but he's not very trendy. I think there is something around that. It feels a bit like we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. There's a lot there. And also, as well, when you think about Freud, I'm sure not many people do think about Freud the way I do on a daily basis, is, he was actually ahead of his time. His views on women are interesting, but at one point he does say, you know what, I've still no idea, after working with women, what women want. I don't think a lot of men can probably appreciate that. but also there's something around he was a point in time. So I'm sure in 50 years people will laugh at us with some of the ideas that we have. So it's no wonder that we look back at some of his ideas and go, no. But there's so much in there that and the other thing is that I really noticed in the coaching supervision diploma is in a lot of coach trainings, there's not a lot of academic theory. There's a lot of practice, and so there should be because it's a practical application, but there's not a lot of academic theory. Whereas in the coaching supervision diploma, there was. And that, for me, is a place where we can get hold of some of these concepts and think, okay, so how does this work with coaching? What can I learn from this and apply to my work as a coach? I feel like I've gone a million times around the house, but I get so excited talking about this topic that you might need to rein me in.
Not at all. I mean, you and I think share the same way of thinking about this. In as much my perspective was more existential than psychodynamic. But of course, when I designed the ICCS curriculum, it was very much with ideas in mind. And I don't think of them as theories. I think of them as ideas, which is a lot less rigid. But ideas can influence how we practice and how we think about the work we're doing. So moving into the journey towards supervision, how long were you a coach before supervision it sort of came on your radar or something you felt ready to do?
That is, it is funny how time plays a part in it. So when I was training as a coach, again, back in the swirls of time, supervision just wasn't a big thing. And also, I was trained by an American company and they were not big on supervision. And I remember thinking, but I come from a world of mental health services, and literally the day you walk in to a social care service, you're allocated a supervisor, you're told what supervision is. It's it so I feel like in my career I grew up with supervision, and it was quite a surprise for me to learn that it wasn't such a big thing. So actually one of the things that me and a peer on that course did was we set up peer supervision. And because I in mental health services, I was a supervisor. I'd been a supervisor. She'd been a supervisor in NHS services. So we were like, you know what, this is a big deal. We need to do it. And so it was there, but not a big thing. And I'd always thought, what is it like to be a coaching supervisor? And then the pandemic hit. And as for a lot of people, coaching was a luxury that, if you think about, well, do I feed my children or do I have coaching? You feed your kids, um, depending how you feel about them that day. Uh, and that's when I thought, okay, my coaching work hadn't completely dried up, but it was thinner than I wanted it to be. And I thought, you know what? I've got the time. I'm not doing a school run. I'm not doing other bits and pieces. I've got the time. Let's investigate becoming a coaching supervisor because I think now's the time to add to my portfolio.
Interesting. And so, given that you had been a supervisor before, clinical supervision, presumably, if it was in the sort of, yeah, what did you then begin to look for in a course? What mattered to you?
So the things that mattered to me were I wanted some rigor, I wanted some academic thinking, I wanted new perspectives, and I wanted to meet people. That's the other thing. I mean, for me, coaching is all about. I mean, from the very basics of me and my client, the relationship has to work, right through to my coaching community. The relationships have to work. It's so important. So I wanted to meet. Sounds like a dating app. Like-minded people. But I wanted to meet like-minded people. Meet like-minded people. I wanted to, and I did, and some of whom become incredibly good friends. And I wanted to challenge myself, and I wanted to learn in a different way. And I wanted a program that knew what it was doing.
Yeah. Oh, that's very nice to hear. And I remember when we spoke after you qualified, because you did that essay on psychodynamic literature in coaching, I think, but it might be in supervision. And I remember you saying to me that you were quite surprised in a way how little literature there was, both within our program but also in the wider world around psychodynamic. How have you since applied or thought about your field of work, i.e., psychodynamic ideas, within the supervision field? Has it sort of come to life more for you? How is that sort of shaping up?
Oh, absolutely. So one of my friends that I met on the coaching and supervision diploma, she's fabulous. She all we bonded over a love of Freud. And she said to me, she went, "Oh, I think we need to do a podcast." And I was like, "Yeah, yeah, 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 yeah." And the amount of people then that I was, through running workshops or doing all kinds of things were like, "You really ought to do a podcast on this." And then just randomly last year, there was, and I'd had another coaching colleague that had also set up their own podcast, and I thought, well, about it. The company that she did it with did a Black Friday thing, and I was like, okay, it's now affordable. Let's set up my podcast. So that's one of the things that I do. I now have a podcast called The Dynamics of Everyday Life, which is a play on Freud's psychopathology of everyday life for those real psychodynamic geeks among us. And basically, what I do there is I take everyday concepts. So, let's have a think about one. A friend of mine and I had a conversation in a car, and she was talking about literally something to do with the tennis club where she was running some program. She was like, "Oh, honestly, it's like I feel like I'm always being picked last for PE." And I went, "That is a great podcast title." And I actually sort of like applied that into why do we always feel like in a group we might be the last one picked, or we might put ourselves at the bottom of a list or something. So I tied it in that way and applied a bit of theory so that we can understand ourselves better. So I've taken it that way and done that. I've also recently done a workshop for the ICF Italy chapter on coaching and defense mechanisms, and really started saying let's bring this into the coaching room. Let's look at what might be happening here. I did a workshop as well for NHS Coaching North England, where I spoke to a lot of coaches who were also consultants, as in medical consultants, and we had some fantastic conversations. They're particularly doctors who worked in brain surgery were like, "Yeah, but my understanding of unconscious is very, very different to the Freudian concept of unconscious." Really incredible conversations with people. So that's how I do it. I'm writing some articles. I'm on a mission now to bring Freud back.
Very nice. And as a supervisor, do you kind of label yourself a psychodynamic supervisor, or are you just a supervisor and you use that as a sort of part of your everyday work?
Well, if you looked at my LinkedIn profile, I describe myself as a psychodynamic executive coach. Um, what I say to people is I will always favor the psychodynamic approach. But if that is not what the client, either the coach that I'm supervising or my coaching client, if that's not what they need, then I'm not going to be, forcing it in just onto somebody, and almost a bit like, we're coming up to Parenthood season. I'm not going to be almost like one of the ugly sisters forcing a shoe on that doesn't fit. It's I'm not going to be like that. It does inform my work, and a lot of people that I work with find it useful. But if you're like, you know what, that doesn't speak to me, that's fine.
Makes sense. Coming back to the training, very few people that join our program already have supervision experience. They tend to be coaches who have got a lot of coaching experience. They come to supervision and they're like, "Whoa, I wasn't expecting this. I've got to think about the systems, and I've got to be more authoritative in times, and da da da." Whereas you came to this with clinical supervision experience. Was there anything about coaching supervision that felt different, or that you had to kind of stretch yourself into in some way?
Yes. It's a I like the use of the word stretching because that's how I describe it. As coaches, we're always encouraged to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And for me as a supervisor, it's it was a stretching of that. So when you do clinical supervision, it's you're coming much more from a place of knowing. Whereas a coaching supervisor, you're sat next to the coach. You don't know. I mean, you might throw a few ideas around and go, "Oh, this is coming up for me. I'm wondering what if that makes any sense to you, or am I completely barking up the wrong tree?" So it was that the difference. You're not coming from a place of knowing so much or expected to have the answers. Now, sometimes you might be expected to have the answers where it comes to maybe something ethical, um, or safeguarding. You really might need to be pointing somebody, say you need to do this or you need to check in this way. But realistically, you're much more in that not knowing position. So it's a stretching of that. I'm comfortable with being uncomfortable.
And how does that feel for you? I mean, was that a good thing to shake off that knowing, or does it feel a bit like, no, I still want that knowing wrapped around me?
Well, let's be honest. To start with, I think I was a bit like, oh, I'm not sure about this. But actually, that it's incredibly liberating, isn't it? Where you think, I actually don't need to know the answers. I can offer you what's coming up for me, but I don't need to know the answers. And I found it once I was able to almost like get rid of the anxiety around it, I did find it quite freeing.
It's so interesting. That word liberating comes up so much when I talk to supervisors, much more so than coaching. Most people who become supervisors say how liberating it feels to not be shackled by the constraints of coaching, which can often feel like a little bit like you know, too tight sometimes, but at the same time, liberated from having to know the answers as a more typical supervisor, managerial or psychotherapeutic. So it's interesting how often that word comes up. And I'm curious, now as a supervisor, other than the moral imperative that you mentioned, creating peer supervision, what is it you love about supervision? Or what do you enjoy about the process of supervision compared to maybe some of your other practices?
Similar to what I love about coaching. People are fascinating. I'm genuinely interested in people, not from a nosy perspective. Although I suspect we all have a little bit of that if we're absolutely honest with ourselves. But I genuinely love talking to people and listening to people and learning from people. And one of the things about coaching supervision is, well, a coach will come and they'll go, "Well, I did that," and I think, "Oh, God, that was brilliant. I'm sure I'd have known to do that." So it does it it enhances my practice, but there's just something about that supervision relationship that it adds something else to your work. And I was just thinking actually, because I was thinking when I did my first coach training, I mean, it is years ago, so things have moved on. And we were always taught that we should aim for at least one light bulb moment, one aha moment per session. Now, I don't know about you, but if you could, whip up a light bulb moment every session, I mean, quite frankly, I'd have made a million. I'd be sat on Oprah's sofa with my list of best-selling books. It doesn't happen like that. You have your light bulb moments when you're washing your hair or emptying the dishwasher or, you know, sorting out the ironing, because that's when your brain is free to do it. But I have found that in supervision, maybe because the space itself is freer, that there are more light bulb moments where the coach will go, "Oh, I'd never seen that situation that way." Or, "Actually, no, I'm talking about it because verbal processing is, so key. Now I'm talking about it, I can actually see what's going on." And that I find really fascinating about supervision.
Yeah, yeah. So I wonder if it's okay to begin to wrap this up by looking at the future for you. And I love the idea of your podcast. I wasn't aware you had a podcast, and I will check that out. And I did notice the play on Freud's title, but that definitely is a nerdy connection, isn't it, for sure? But when you think about the future for your practice, for supervision, for everything you're doing, what do you see ahead for yourself?
Well, that is it's such a good question because I honestly I've got some ideas. but I'm playing around with a few things at the moment. So I love doing my podcast. My podcast makes me incredibly happy because I feel I'm also studying at Tavistock at the moment. So I'm doing their executive coaching program because they teach psychodynamics. And when we go up for our in-person sessions, which I love, we walk past Freud's statue. And sometimes I walk past and I think, would you be proud of my podcast? I hope so. It'd probably tell me off for getting some of the theory wrong, but I'd like to think he'd appreciate the intention. So I'm the podcast I want to grow and develop. I am starting to write some articles now, really taking everyday situations and saying, okay, well, this happens because one of my big feelings is social media doesn't treat us as very clever. And we're a lot more intelligent than social media makes us out to be. No, do you remember? I don't know about you, but I never remember a meme, and some of these are so short and meaningless. They don't do anything. Whereas a little bit of academic knowledge, a little bit of, like you say, an idea, you give somebody that and they're like, oh, maybe I don't want to do that anymore. And so I'm starting to write articles around that. Maybe I'll write a book on it. I want to do more training around it because I still think we are missing something. I still think we're doing our clients a disservice by not giving them these ideas. And I think there's a gap for me that I don't know how I'm going to fill it, but I will fill it. I'm kind of working that out at the moment. And I think there's definitely room for advanced supervision work. So a lot of the coaches that I've talked to who've gone through training programs, etc., or who have done supervision programs are like, okay, that's great. I've kind of got the basics. I'd like some advanced stuff. So I think there's a gap there, but I'm at that kind of a child and you played with clay and you're kind of just like pressing it, thinking, I don't know what I'm going to make, but I'm going to make something. So I feel like I'm at that stage at the moment. But one thing that I'm truly grateful to the coaching supervision diploma for was giving me that foundation that of bringing psychodynamics back into my world. Because it was there, but I didn't know what to do with it. And if it hadn't been for my colleague and now friend on the coaching supervision diploma, I don't know that I'd have had the guts to do a podcast. I don't know that I would. So indirectly, it's thanks to you, Nick, that it's there. So yeah, that's kind of what's in the future for me. I guess watch this space. Who knows?
Yeah. Watch this clay. See what comes
Yes,
of it.
watch this clay.
Before we wrap up, Julie, is there anything else that I haven't brought out from you in this conversation that you might want to share about either being a supervisor or the journey to becoming a supervisor or anything else that's sort of on your mind that you thought, oh, I'd really like to share that little nugget?
Well, I think the only other thing that really stood out for me is, and I experienced this, and I know everybody else who's trained to be a supervisor has said this, is that my coaching got better. Indescribably better, which was a really lovely byproduct to have. And all the people from the cohort, I actually spoke this week to, actually I was having coaching this week with a colleague of mine who did the ICCS diploma a couple of years after I did. And we were both saying how much better our coaching got through it. And I don't think that should be, what's the word I want? I don't think that should be underestimated.
Yeah, I totally agree. I remember training as a supervisor myself for the first time, 11, 12 years ago. And I remember that experience myself, suddenly being able to see yourself as a coach and think, oh, that's what I'm doing. Or, it's fascinating. Wow, amazing. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your journey today. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'm really delighted to hear the impact that the program made for you by opening up the space for you to to kind of come back to yourself really. So thank you for sharing that.
No, it's my absolute pleasure. I'm incredibly grateful for it. And if anybody's thinking about whether they should train to be a supervisor or not, I'll be like, yeah, go for it. If nothing else, your clients will thank you for it.
Thank you so much, Julia.
It's my pleasure.